Yeah, we're ready.
Okay, wonderful. So welcome to the Academic Excellence Celebration for McKendree University, one of my favorite days of the year on campus, because the students, like the one I'm about to introduce, get to show off their research that they've been working on. I'm happy to have y'all here. Just a couple of housekeeping reminders. It looks like everybody's on mute, so I think we've got the hang of Zoom now after being on for about a year, but please keep yourself muted throughout the presentation. But feel free to type in any questions that you might have for Brian into the chat. He's going to entertain questions at the very end after he does his presentation. And we are actually not going to record the Q&A part of this session. So he will do his presentation. He has about 18, 19, 20 minutes perhaps, and then he will entertain your questions. So as he's going along though, feel free to type in those questions into the chat and he will answer them at the very end. So it is my pleasure to introduce Brian Ahle. I've had him in many of my classes and he is a joy to have in class. He is actually a double major in both political science and business. And today he is going to be discussing a very timely topic, polarization in the United States. So Brian, take it away.
All right, so just want to make sure everyone. Can everyone see my screen right now? Yes, awesome. Perfect. Okay. So, as Dr. Collins just said, I chose to focus on a very timely problem that we seem to be having with our country right now, the idea of polarization and exactly why are we so divided among political ideologies and political groups. So I wanted to pursue that question as it's just caused major issues, especially in these last decade or so, as we've kind of begun to separate ourselves based on just how we view politics. It's become such a social identity for some people to the point that, you know, we can't get along with people that don't see eye to eye with us, that we cannot even begin to actually be able to socialize, be able to be friends technically with people that are not in the same affiliation as us. So after going through, you know, my extensive research, I've come to the conclusion that there's four main central points that I believe that people become divided over and that have caused such a mass polarization for our country. So the 4 points of separation that I chose to focus on, first and foremost, our political party system. We tend to have such a division between Democrats and Republicans, and obviously, you know, other smaller parties, but primarily the two political parties just not being able to work together and be able to compromise together has caused extreme issues between our population. My second point of separation is race, and we've seen so much over the past 10 years, especially just how much that this has become an issue. Obviously, just yesterday, the George Floyd verdict came in on Derek Chauvin, and just how much that affected us, the new and multiple, you know, cases of police brutality that have gone on lately. So race has just become such a big divider for us. The third point of separation, religion, and just how much certain religions tend to coincide with politics. I mean, obviously we talk about separation of church and state, but that's just becoming less and less of the case as more people just become drawn to the sphere of politics that target and help their religion. And then finally, I wanted to look at economics and class and just seeing that, you know, we have different class. We have upper class, middle class, lower class, and certain certain policy affects them in different ways. Certain policy allows larger benefits for each class, and I think that becomes a certain amount of division as we move forward. So, little fun quote by George Washington on political parties. however, political parties may now and then answer popular ends. They are likely in the course of time and things to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which have lifted them to unjust dominion. So I think this is like a fairly famous thing at this point, that George Washington was very, very opposed to the concept of political parties. Obviously, just as a founding father, it's kind of interesting that he forewarned of such a thing so early on, and we obviously chose to ignore it. However, just seeing where we are now and how they have, in many cases, this quote has come to life very, very often. So when looking at our political parties sphere, we have been dominated by a two-party system for most of our country's lifetime. First, it became the Federalist First Democratic Republicans from 1792 to 1820. After this, we were kind of led into a point where the Democratic Republican dominated for a decade or so, with just having a one-party system primarily. Before the Whigs came to fruition, the Democrats became the Democratic Republicans. This typical part of the two-party system lasted for 30 years or so, from the 1830s to the 1860. And then by 1860, we had introduced the Democrats versus Republican system that we now have today, although it was a little different, and obviously those sides kind of flipped at one point. So a lot of the policy that Democrats now support, Republicans supported back in the past, and vice versa. Once we get to the 1950s, we kind of started seeing the idea of candidate-centered politics. When discussing that, it was basically the concept that political parties no longer had near as much of an influence on who they wanted as their presidential candidate. It became much more of, down to the people and who could get a following with the people, as opposed to before, the political party kind of had complete control of that and had the ability to pick their candidates. So the idea of the candidate-centered politic was that these were certain people, certain candidates that were able to, not necessarily, they didn't have a distinct political affiliation until they started running for politics. And then they would pick it up basically on their ideology. So the two examples that I provide, Ronald Reagan, Donald Trump, they both, Donald Trump especially has always been a big, advocate of, he was more so a Democrat previously, in previous years where, but he chose to go for lead the candidateship for the Republican Party just because he believed that it was where he could get more of a vote from. So I also believe that the candidate-centered politics gave the moderate voter more impact, and just being able to, be able to pick someone that may not be one or the other, but more a little bit in the middle. So the problem that I see with the political parties and why I believe that they are a failure is that they cause you to pick a side. They cause you to have to be one or the other. It's very, very hard to be a moderate voter because there is no chance for your moderate president to be elected. We have smaller third parties. We have the Green Party. We have the Libertarian. But they do not stand a chance because they do not have the funding. They do not have the support system. So it really causes you to have to pick, do I want to vote Republican or do I want to vote Democrat, if you want to make a severe impact on the voting situation, which I think is just very, very detrimental to having getting potentially the best overall candidate for us. Secondly, it kind of groups you by association. I think that, especially over the last 4 years, we view the Republicans as a Trump supporter. I just don't think that's the case. I think that those are two separate things. I think that there was plenty of Republicans that just did not agree with much of what Donald Trump did. I think that there were obviously some that did, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're grouping them. So I think that, people can affiliate with one or the other and still be fairly moderate. I think that that's kind of been forgotten over the last few years, where, you don't necessarily have to be one or the other. You can be sort of in the center, even though you might have voted for Trump or you might have not. Third, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, is that parties just set up a concept of social identity. I think that nowadays people, I mean, this is a large part of your personality at this point, where it's like, if you support one or the other, that is, you are recognized as that, especially if you're vocal about it. People will define you as a liberal or as a Democrat or as a Republican or a conservative. And I think that this can be overall like damaging to how we interact with each other. I just don't believe that. I think that it's become such an interesting situation where people have trouble interacting with people that do not affiliate with the same group that they do. And then finally, parties just have an issue of causing a lack of cooperation for the greater good. There's no compromise, and political gridlock has definitely seen an increase as of late, as Democrats and Republicans just struggle to get along as good as they used to. So the second point of emphasis that I chose to focus on was race. As most of us know, our nation's practically been built on racial division since the beginning. We've had so many issues of slavery, civil war, segregation, the Jim Crow laws, the civil rights movement, and then recently, cases of police brutality. And there's reasons for this. We are moving towards what is called a majority minority, where whites will no longer make up the majority of the population. Our groups of minorities will be the larger group overall. Obviously, we take a collective of all of them, but I think that this has caused people to start panicking. Some people just don't like change, and they will do anything to keep things the same. And then that's what's happening now, is that we're seeing more and more of the minority become a larger part of the population, having more control and having more freedoms and rights and everything. And people just have struggled to accept the idea of change. So as we move forward, it is clear that this is going to happen. So it's kind of, people just need to start hopping on the wheel of realizing that things are changing. However, obviously that's not happening. We're picking up conflict as people want to stay the same. And I think that this is a large part of what made Donald Trump such an alluring candidate for a lot of people, is that it was, the whole quote of "Make America Great Again," an emphasis on the again part. People wanted someone to bring him back to a time that they thought was a more prestigious time of America, or, he is not trying to change things, he is trying to revert things. So I think that was a major spark for what allowed him to come to the presidency. The third point to look at was religion. This was a thing that practically came up as strong as it did with Ronald Reagan in the 1980s and his sorry, this word is always tough for me. Evangelical Christianity and the conservative right. So his policy to support religion through advocating prayer in schools and the teaching of creationism really, really got him a large following with the Christians. And so this is why Christians are now typically affiliated with much of the conservative right, as they have always been more to support the concept of more supporting Christianity within the political sphere. So during this time, though, Americans began abandoning religion. We are more likely to be unaffiliated now than ever in American history, because of its extension to politics. And they learned that if they did not agree with a certain amount of political belief, if they did not believe in the other policy that the right was teaching, that they just didn't want to extend that with their religion. So that's why much of the unaffiliated tend to lean left towards the Democratic Party. However, I believe that politicized religion also poses the question of, how much is this a natural belief and how much is this just trying to gather support? So I think that it's fair to question exactly why the right tends to favor policy that affects LGBTQ rights and abortion. I think that much of the understanding of that is that it is very, very ingrained in the concept of religion within politics, and having, these beliefs within their own religion, whether or not these are correct by by God's standards. I think that the right often tends to favor these policies because they're trying to attract that vote. They're trying to have people believe that they want to make this change in order to keep the religious vote. So, and then my final point of emphasis that I chose to focus on was economy and class. For the Republicans, they tend to provide tax breaks and promote benefits to that of businesses to support the upper class. They focus on the concept of trickle-down economics, which, for those of you that are not familiar, is the idea that if we support the upper class and support businesses and everything like that, that money and that currency will eventually trickle down into the lower class. So basically, by making the rich richer, you also make the poor richer. And obviously, like, these concepts are favored by the upper class. And then Democrats tend to support the lower class, looking to pass policy on social welfare and rising taxes on businesses and the upper class. So, obviously, this creates a certain conflict between upper and lower class, as each of these political parties are looking to kind of gather support from one class to the other. So that in itself is creating conflict between the two classes, as they both want what is more beneficial for themselves, obviously. Then obviously, we have our two primary classes, but I think many people forget middle class, which by my research, kind of, as far as I understood it, they are the best at exemplifying the breaking of polarization. This middle class can go so many different ways. Some support, the right, some support the left. They are typically more or less the more moderate voters, just because they have a little more room in which both policies kind of affect them one way or another. They're not taking massive gains off of businesses, and they're not also getting much of the relief that the lower class does through Democratic policies. So, and they choose to express their opinions on other factors and to make their decisions a little more based on things that fall out of the economic class. And I think the 2008 presidential election really, really sparked the idea of economy separation. How we became very polarized in this sense was that in 2008, obviously, we're coming off the 2008 recession, and much of the campaigns, the primary question was definitely on just exactly how we were going to offer the relief for the recession. And in the end, Obama's policy just really offered far more in relief than McCain's policies did. So I think that this was a primary reason for Barack Obama becoming president, was just that he offered at that time the answer to the biggest question as far as the election went, and that was just how to handle post-recession relief. Finally, I want to talk about an idea that I think has come to fruition much more, obviously, in the last 4 years, and that's the effect Donald Trump had on all this. He, was such a polarizing character. Not even a president, just as a human being. Someone that elicited emotion from everyone. Someone that really, and I even title it here, had an effect on people. This was what I consider the Trump effect. It didn't even become about parties for a minute. It was, do you vote for Trump or do you not vote for Trump? Do you like Trump? Do you not like Trump? And I want to reiterate that I think that he was not the cause of any of this. I think that as we have looked in this presentation, I've shown that, we have built up polarization since the beginning of this country, since, you know, we have had these issues, we have had separation, we have had reasons to believe that, you know, we just are always going to disagree on things. So he's not the cause of this, but he did nothing to help it. He came in at a perfect time, a perfect point where, you know, division was starting to get worse. I think that it happens regardless, but I think that he emphasized that he caused a larger issue as coming to presidency. People just had such strong opinions on him as a person that it really, really caused an even stronger division among our population. We're all familiar with many of the tactics he brought through. Emotion, he elicited emotion from everyone, you know, whether you supported what he did, whether you did not, one way or the other, he caused you to believe in something very, very strongly. And I think that really did not help in polarizing our nation as we just began to separate more and more, trying to either associate or disassociate with him during his presidency. With all that being said, I think that we are definitely possibly heading to better days. We now have a president, Joe Biden, who, in my opinion, might be the most moderate president we might have in quite some time. As far as just his policy, you know, he stands for the middle much more than I think that many candidates have in the past and many do in the future. Unfortunately, this is a harsh reality of how we tend to come together as a country, but tragedy is what brings us together. Through the world wars 9/11, you know, I think that these were 2 points in our country's time where we had the least polarization, where we came to grasp and came to work together better than ever before. I think that once we realized that our general population is in trouble, and it's something as alarming as these 2 incidents, or these 3 incidents, it becomes much easier to come together, to work together, to figure out what is best for as many people as possible. And that comes into the third note that I have here, is just to work for the collective and not the individual. We need to begin to focus more on what is better for the entire general population of our country, rather than instead focusing on what may just be good for us as an individual, or maybe just be good for us as like a family. It's important to still look at, you know, if it's going to hurt you a little but might hurt someone else a lot, you know, it might just be better to take yourself in that situation. And then I think we have shown that we have the ability to compromise in the past. I just believe that, you know, in order to ever help try and solve this a little bit better, we need to continue to work to try and compromise as much as possible in order to be successful as a nation. And that is all. So